All right, everybody. So today we have Matt Terry on the podcast. How you doing, Matt?
Good day. What's up, man?
So this was a little bit different, only in the sense that you reached out to me, and oftentimes when somebody reaches out to me, it's like a total gimmicky thing, right? It's like try this like new fat loss tea or some crap like that, right? The last person that reached out to me, not the last one, but like probably one of the bigger name ones was that guy. If you happen to see the podcast, John Jaquish with his like X3 bands, which is
Oh
was
yeah.
interesting because the dude's got like 1 million followers, so that was unusual. And then that turned into a whole mess. I made a follow-up video, all that stuff. So I
I saw
don't,
something about that. Yeah.
yeah, I don't think that's gonna happen here. But
No.
you have, your own credentials. I mean, both in terms of education, but also performances and competitions and stuff. So I'm guessing most people watching don't know who you are at this point. So why don't you just
Mhm.
kind of get into some of your background there?
Sure. So my primary background was Olympic lifting. So I was really good at football in high school and college, and I was really overweight. And so my parents got me a trainer when I was really young. I think like most people, like I just instantly got bit by like the iron bug, and I won my first state title, I think, in powerlifting when I was like 13. And I think I benched like 275 and I deadlift like 385 and I think I weighed 174 and I trained for like 6 months.
At
And so my
13?
my coach was like, well, and at the time I had actually done 315 touch and go. But I had like it was my first powerlifting meet and I didn't really understand some of the techniques and I didn't
Hmm.
bring a spotter. So I did there's a lot of things I kind of screwed up. And so I missed a couple of attempts, but that kind of started everything. And I kind of realized like, oh, I might be kind of good at this. And then when I started looking up, which in full disclosure, I was the only one in my weight class when I won my
Yeah.
title, which is kind of funny. But when I looked at the ages above and below me, I was still beating almost everyone, even up to like 18. And I was like, in those weight classes. And I
Hmm.
was like, well, maybe there's something to this. So anyway, just through football, I just kind of really got into it. And I started competing in Olympic lifting when I think I won my first national championship, and that was like 15. And then so that kind of took me to I was a resident athlete at the Olympic Training Center, and I competed in Olympic weightlifting for 7 years at very high levels. I won the 2000 Olympic trials. I was a three-time national champion. I competed in the World Championships, Pan Am Games. I've medaled everywhere. And for me, it was just more like strength sports were always my background. And the thing that I really felt interesting about Olympic lifting is even though it's so technical, it's not as strength based as people think. And looking back on it, I think retrospectively, I was in the wrong sport because even though my Olympic lifts were good, they weren't like amazing.
Hmm.
But we'll talk about that in a second. We see kind of drugs get involved. I think it kind of skews people perspective. But when I retired, I think I did my best lifts when I was like 20 or 21, and I snatched 155 kilos and I clean jerked 195. I was a 94 kilo lifter and I back squatted 280 kilos for like a triple. And I could stand in military press like 140 kilos. So I was just like strength levels and stuff. Like I could bench 400 for like a set. I actually tore my pec doing a set of four on
Okay.
bench press at 405. And my
Wow.
my Olympic coach was extremely pissed he even allowed me to do it because it's not even related to Olympic lifting.
Right.
So my background was just really strong there, and that's just kind of what got me into like training. And then my background in education is I have a degree in exercise science with nutrition. I started as a dietitian, so I've kind of morphed from there, and now I do a lot more of like functional lab and that kind of thing in terms of monitoring people's like blood work and that type of thing. So it's kind of what's taking me up through here is just my background has just always been a really genetically gifted, very strong person, and everything always came really naturally. And I just really liked it. So for me, it was really easy. It was just, my passion fed, like obviously my sports, but because I was so good at it, it always fed itself. But I
Right.
was really overweight. And I was like really overweight when I was a kid. I was probably when I like I said when I benched that when I was 13. I was also like 4'11" and I had like a 44-inch waist. That was like a bowling ball.
Wow.
So for me, like when I got into lifting, it was really more for weight loss and I just wanted to lose weight. And it kind of found that I was actually really strong. And that's kind of what just losing weight and feeling better about myself and just kind of that whole positive thing. That's really kind of what got me into just helping other people. That's kind of where I've been this whole time.
Awesome. So what was the heaviest your body weight got up to? You said, I know you compete at 94,
I
but
got yeah, I competed in 94, but when I played college football, so I did it backwards to the fact that I played football in high school and I was really good, but then I had either the opportunity to either go to the training center or play college football. So I went to training center first and I played college football later. So I kind of did it backwards. But when I played college football, I actually got up to 228 and I'm 5'6".
okay.
And then when I was Olympic lifting, the highest I got was 220. But towards the end of my career with Olympic lifting, the problem was I was becoming so heavy for my weight class. There was such a big jump to the next one. Like I couldn't compete with like because I was like the shortest light super in the world by a
Yeah.
long ways. And
Oh
like the
wow.
next one, I think it was 94. And at the time you could go up to 99 in terms of 99 kilos, but I was giving
Mhm.
up like another 20 pounds. So I was
Yeah,
just
right.
get killed. So I was kind of stuck in between. That's kind of why I quit. I just injuries and I was just getting too big for my weight class and I just didn't want to go to the next one. So I just kind of hung it up.
And how old are you now?
I will be 43 this year.
Okay, so long time in this sport.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, man. Like I've talked about this from like an academic side, as far as like who's big on social media, and then you have some people who are highly published, like Brad Schoenfeld, but you have other people who have published hundreds of papers and are really like high in their territory, but people don't know about them, right? And then like it's basically like who looks the best, but also just who promotes themselves, right? And all of that. And so I think it'll always be the case that there's kind of that social proof people have that shows that they
Mm-hmm.
know what they're talking about. I guess the nice thing is nowadays there is also the recognition for people who know what they're talking about, who maybe don't have the best genetics in the world and things like that. I mean, obviously, as you said, if you're doing that at 13 years old, you have top tier genetics, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you could argue either way, but I think it's still good to like get that out there, because one of the things that people don't think about is that because people gravitate towards what they're good at, most people like they'll say like, well, just because they're really big doesn't mean that they, have pushed the hardest or that they know what they're doing, which is true. The other side of that coin though is that typically if you don't have good genetics, you will never take things to the same point that somebody with great genetics has, because it would just be a bad idea, right? If you were to try to go from like your 95th like best version of yourself to like 100th percentile, it just there'd be so much involved. Like you took it to like a national level, right? So it makes sense. But if you have 20th percentile genetics, you should probably not spend your entire life doing that, right? So you won't have
Mm-hmm.
those experiences of pushing that hard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's true. And I think you see that too as you get in the upper echelons of sports. You really, especially at that level, you realize like the small amounts separate you by so much.
Hmm.
And some of those things, like some of those athletes and just some of the stuff that even some of the extremisms they'll do with the training and even some of the drug use is pretty. I mean, it's there were when I was at the training center, I did a survey and it was basically saying like, if you could win a gold medal in the next year, but you would also die when the next year, would you
Yeah.
do it? And over 60% of people said yes. And I was like, oh my God. I was like, these people's priorities are so screwed, but that's an athlete's mindset.
I've seen that survey talked about for probably a decade now. Do you know where that comes from?
I don't even know where it came from, but it was around the time when they were because they had these posters all over the wall when you'd walk into sports medicine. And it was kind of like it was kind of it was kind of eerie the way they did it because it was about transitioning out of your career. So
Okay.
it was like these few poster series of like you're not going to be doing this forever kind of thing,
Yeah.
and what do you do when you're done, and life after sport. And I was always like, why is that relevant? And as I got older, I was like, oh, it's super relevant. Like I
Yeah,
need a job
right.
now. Like I need to get out of here. Like I don't want to be 40 years old and like living in my parents' basement lifting weights.
Yeah, that was one of the things I remember if you saw the film Bigger, Faster, Stronger. Uh, and I think it was Chris Bell, right?
Mhm.
And they were saying he's like, "Am I going to be this guy?" And there was the guy like in his van, like the powerlifter dude. And he's like,
Yeah,
"Well, if I can still out deadlift you," and he's like 40, 50 years old, and it's just like, man, like,
yeah,
and I
yeah.
just turned 30, so it's not like I'm like old, but even then, the perspective compared to when I was 20 is just like, and what
Mhm.
matters. And I was always a pretty
Mhm.
level-headed person, and even then, it's still pretty different. So I imagine when 40, you really got to consider those things.
Mhm. Mhm. For sure.
So you mentioned, so you obviously when you started, you were natural. At some
Mhm.
point, I guess you had to cross over,
Mhm.
and I guess now you said you're on TRT. Is that right?
Yes. Yep.
So
Started. So I'm 40. I started TRT at 42. So about like 6 months ago, I started TRT.
okay.
Mhm.
So what was the progression? Like when did you make the leap to say, okay, to be really competitive, I had to go the
Mhm.
enhanced route?
So I never took anything when I competed. I was
Okay.
always natural. So I never took anything until I was, like I said, 6 months ago. So I've competed naturally or trained naturally for almost 30 years.
Okay.
So that was kind of, for me, I wanted to do it when I was younger. And I definitely thought about doing when I was competing because I definitely had some teammates who did it. And so it was really attractive. And when you would go to like say the world championships or whatever, and you talk to other guys from other countries and you'd start to become friends with them. And they would be very open about like extremely open about what they took. Like I had one guy who he was the time, his name was Marcus, and I can't remember his last name, but he was from Slovakia and he was like he was actually, I think at the time their world champion. And he could snatch 200 kilos in training. Like he snatched my clean and jerk when he came over, and he looked like a young skinny Arnold, and he sounded like he was super cool. Went back to his room, opens his backpack, and it's just all full of gear, like just all full of gear. And he's at the training center, and I'm like, you get drug tested here, and he's like, like he was like, whatever. And he was like, so what do you take? I was like, we don't take anything. He's like, what do you mean you don't take anything? Like they either thought we were lying or they thought we were idiots. But either way, they just thought it was stupid. And so you started to see some of the drug use and some of the other stuff, and it was really tempting. But I just didn't at the time. I just felt like I wanted to see what I could do naturally without it, and I felt like I would have always second guessed myself if I had taken it. And I was always kind of against it. And honestly, really what probably changed my mind was when I watched Bigger, Faster, Stronger, which is what you just referenced, and just the perspective change of just like, it's not really level playing field. And this isn't something to justify it, but when you're at that level, you see what guys do, and you're like, well, how could someone do that? And I'm like, well, when you have money on the line, you have endorsements on the line, you have a career on the line. Like, forget like gurus who have their own methodologies. That's not what you're talking about. You're talking about athletes who's like, that's their livelihood. You know what I mean? And they'll do anything and extremely competitive. So I also didn't want to do it at the time because I felt like I would abuse it, because my personality is I will do everything to the end. Like if I take a little bit of caffeine, I'll take like 2,000 milligrams a day. So it's like never, you know what I mean? Like there's never a zero for me or middle ground. It's always 0 or 1,000. So I didn't want to get involved in it because I was afraid that I would do something stupid. And when I was young, I was just kind of against it. And then as I got older, I thought, well, if you just take care of yourself and you eat well and you do what you should do, like your testosterone level should stay up naturally. And mine still stayed up. Like before I went on TRT, my total testosterone has always been very high. I mean, even the highest I've ever seen was 936. And that was 6 months ago before I went on TRT. But my free testosterone has always been very low. It was 7. So, I mean, I was just like, and if you look at the reference ranges and you look at the probably the research on the free testosterone, most guys say they feel better when it's between like 25 to 35. And so I just had my labs redone and my free is at 24 and I feel amazing. And part of the reason why I decided to transfer and go on TRT as I age is I was really researching it more for the joint benefits. And I had some clients who were on it. I have several clients who are on it, and I have several friends in the area who are on it. And a lot of them are saying, like, man, my joints just don't hurt anymore. And the energy, and just kind of like the overall well-being. And I was really more, as I'm aging now, I was really more attracted to it from that standpoint. Like I've always been big. I've always been really strong. I still train. Like I'm obviously not as big and as strong as I was then, but I don't train that way. I mean, I was training like 3 or 4 times a day then. I mean, I train once a day now and I'm 40 and I walk 25,000 steps a day because I have a full client load. I'm always on my feet. Like you can't recover from that stuff. Yeah. So you can't train that way anymore. But I just noticed like just my knees were hurting, my back was hurting. I was just really tired all the time, no matter what I did. And I mean, I was like going to bed at 9, getting up at 6, like doing everything you can possibly do, reducing my client schedule, like doing so much so a normal person would never do all these things to try and increase their testosterone or feel better. So I was like, well, I'll try it. And yeah, like the first week I did it, I felt tremendously better. Like
now this is just testosterone, no like growth hormone.
I don't do
nope.
Like that. Nope. I didn't do anything. And I take 120 milligrams testosterone Subcutaneous a week.
Yeah.
And I do. So I like to inject daily. I found that works best for me. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a couple things. So one, I do know people who say like, even because like I have a few actually surprising number of clients on TRT, even like younger clients. And, one guy is on undecanoate, which, he injects like once every 3 months, which I'm shocked that he actually says his levels are pretty stable in blood work, but I know people who are on like cypionate or nanthate and they'll take, like a bolus dose once a week, which is really how it's recommended as far as like from like the medical literature. But they'll peak and then they'll go down. So a lot of times people do prefer 4 to 7 times a week. But most of the time, I mean, I don't hear too many people talk about the joint benefits alone, unless they add like some growth hormone or DECA. Certainly energy, libido, strength, if they've gone down, although your testosterone seemed like it was fairly normal. Did you notice a subsequent drop in SHBG, or did you just notice that your total went up so much that it's still proportional?
So my SHEB just really hasn't changed. It's always been around 60 or 70. So it's always pretty decent. What was interesting is, so the lab range, because I pull my lab at the LabCorp, it only went to 1500 on the total testosterone. So like that's as high as my new levels are.
Yeah.
But what I thought was interesting was my estrogen was originally 38. And if you look at the people like, oh, well, it's a little high. I'm like, it's actually not that high in relation to how high that natural testosterone is, because there's a ratio, right? So it went from 38 to 39. On 120 milligrams. Like I didn't wow. Like there's no aromatase. Like I don't have any estrogen conversion. Like, and again, all I do is I do 15 milligrams. Like 6 days a week, and I do 30 on Mondays. So so
Okay.
that comes out to 120 a week. And
Yeah.
that's just what I've done since I started. My goal was to do as little as I possibly could without, and that's the thing. I think if you look at a lot of the TRT research and they follow what's probably current, it's more frequent injections, more smaller doses, and then also the argument between, is it going to be like sub Q versus IM? I've done
Yeah.
both. I've tracked both versus labs. I actually have some female clients who are on TRT, and is testosterone is part of it, and they actually do injections as part of their therapy from their practitioner, but they won't do intramuscular because they don't like it. So they all do sub Q, and I monitor all their labs. And so either way works, because some people argue, like, like in terms of injection, it doesn't matter. Some people might definitely respond better to other things, but I primarily do intramuscular. I just rotate between shoulders.
Yeah, the literature I've seen on sub-Q versus intramuscular wasn't super compelling. I mean, I've only seen a couple studies on it. One suggested lower aromatization, but there's
Mm-hmm.
obviously fat cells if you're doing sub-Q, so there could be more aromatase. I've seen people report both. Have you noticed any consistent trend or not really?
So what I saw, there's actually some studies, if you actually look on like essentially gender transformations or transgenders, when they're using, because in those studies they only do sub-Q.
Mm,
And I actually saw the study where they broke down how much they were giving these women who are trying to transfer to men, and they would look at their subsequent blood levels. And some of these women, like, I think there's one of them, they were giving them like, the study was between 25 to 100, I believe it was a week. And some of the women on 100 a week were like, I saw one, she had like 900 in terms of
wow.
like total time. I mean, it was crazy. So some women really respond to it, but they were only doing sub Q. They weren't doing any IM, and they were tracking pre and post. So that's kind of interesting.
It's interesting that your levels are so high, only 125, because, for
Hmm.
people who are listening who maybe don't know that much about it, I mean, generally speaking, you're going to be completely shut down on that level. So it's not like, oh, well, he was at 900, so he added the 125 on top of that. It's like, well, no, if you have a normal human body, you should be producing
Hmm.
almost none. And
Hmm.
normally 125 would maybe get you in that 1,000 to 1,200 range.
Hmm. And that is the one thing that, when I was doing the research, when you're doing like trying to really go on the lower end of TRT, there is a tightrope there, because like you said, if you take testosterone, you shut off SH and LSH, you're not going to make it anymore. So your testicle shrink. But then the second side of that is, if you go too low on your TRT dosage, you shut off your own production, and now
Mm.
you're not taking enough to replace it. And that's where some guys I know start to feel like really like crap. Like I had one client who's like, "Well, I take 50 a week. I don't notice anything." Like, because you're taking 50 a week, like
Yeah.
you're probably actually screwing yourself up. So no, I've actually fluctuated between 100 and 120, just kind of back and forth. My goal is
Mm.
to try and do as low as I can.
Sure, sure. So you said you stopped competing at 21 years old?
In Olympic lifting, I did.
Okay. And then you
Hmm.
competed. Did you powerlifted or after that?
So I did powerlifting after that, and I did natural bodybuilding after that. So the last show I
Okay.
actually competed in natural bodybuilding was 6 years ago.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I've
Um,
competed up naturally until up until now, I'm no longer natural, quote unquote. But the last time I competed was 6 years ago, and I would have competed again. And I had a stomach surgery and a bunch of just digestive issues, so it took me out of the scope for like probably 3 years. And so
wow.
I'm just really kind of getting back into it for the last couple of years.
So when you were competing in powerlifting, what were your best big three there?
So I did those when I was younger, but my best was so these would be more touch and go. These aren't like actual, like in terms of meet competition standards. But when you're doing Olympic lifting, Olympic lifting squats are always going to meet powerlifting standards because they're ass to grass. So it doesn't matter, you know what I mean, in terms of depth.
Yeah.
But 450 was my bench at 220. I did squat 700 with a belt and knee wraps, no suit. And my deadlift has always been pretty poor. I've never actually deadlifted more than 550 before.
That is interesting. Wow. That's such a
I
big
can't.
difference.
I can't deadlift that much, and I've got a good grip. But the problem is just my low back. It's just not strong enough.
Wow. Yeah, I think I would imagine the height is a factor there too, right? I mean, you said you're 5'6", so for benching and squatting, especially if you're kind of barrel chested, which I've seen your pictures, you definitely are. The range of motion there is obviously going to be beneficial compared to if you have, I don't know what your arm span is, but generally speaking, not as beneficial for deadlifts.
Yeah, exactly. And that's part of the problem with the deadlift is it's just when you're shorter and you have short arms, you have a longer pull, right?
Mm,
But yeah, I'm built to squat and deadlift. I'm just not, or sorry, squat and bench. I'm just not built to deadlift.
right. So you said even though you're competing in powerlifting later, your strongest was when you were younger. Is that because you lost a lot of weight or?
Yeah. So that was what I would say when I competed in powerlifting was post college football when I was at my biggest, and then after that I kind of tailored down and dieted a little bit more.
All right. And then as far as competing in natural bodybuilding, what organizations did you do and what did you compete at, like weight wise?
So it's like I think it's like the NAF. It's a natural one. I did the Natural Golds Classic here in Kansas City. And so they don't actually, I competed it. I cut from 215 to 169, and that took about 7 or 8 months.
Okay.
And you can actually see on my website, I actually have the before and after. I kind of talk about what I did just to talk about the process, but you can see like the transformation in terms of what I did. But I was, so was it, it's based off height. So you have a tall class, short class, whatever. So I was in the short class, obviously.
Mhm.
So in that particular federation, they don't use weight. And for bodybuilding, they just do by height. And
Okay.
so I was in the short class, and I did, I was a novice, obviously, because it was my first show, and I took second, and I got third Mr. Kansas, and I took second overall.
Okay.
But the thing I noticed from that show was when some of the guys who were competing were getting to know each other, I was probably 20 or 25 pounds heavier than every single guy in my class. I mean, they were most of them
Really?
like 140, 140. I mean, they were so shredded and tiny weight. I mean, I was so much bigger than they were,
Yeah.
and not near as lean, but it was a good learning experience.
So if you got as lean as they were, what weight do you think you would have had to come in at?
I would, I would say probably 158 or 155.
Yeah.
I mean, and I still would have been much bigger, but man, I mean, some of those guys were legitimate, like probably probably sub six. I
Yeah.
mean, striated glute, striated hamstring. I mean, I'd never seen some of the guys that were that ripped naturally. I mean, but again, you're lighter, so it's easier. But I
Right.
mean, just with great development and huge backs and big legs, and I was like, geez Louise. I mean, I was really impressed.
Yeah. Well, that's what's interesting about bodybuilding because I feel like it like getting that lean is like the great equalizer, right? Like obviously when
Hmm.
you go the enhanced route, it's different, but like from like a natural standpoint, you just don't see guys that compete that heavy, especially at like 5'6". I mean, if you had to get down to one, let's say 58, right, to be as lean as they are, like 158 is just not what you think of as like a big person. Now, I'm sure, given you would have been completely shredded, you would have looked super impressive. But
Hmm.
even with like these like crazy strength, I think of Greg Knuckles or somebody like that, where it's like this dude is like so strong, but to get contest lean, I mean, I would think he'd probably have to be like 175, like kind of like every other natural around his height. Like, so there's the strength and size are different, even if you have both. Like, I think
Hmm.
there seems to be more genetic freak aspects in terms of strength. Like some people where it's just like, what is going on here, right? Because it's not just muscle mass, right? It's muscle mass, it's insertions, it's limb length, it's like neurological and all that stuff. So if you're top tier in all of those, you just get this crazy beast, right? So
Hmm. Absolutely. And some of the natural guys, I was just they either weren't natural or they were just. I mean, but you like what you were saying earlier. People rise to the top of sports they're gifted in, and if you're
mhm,
naturally lean and you're naturally muscular anyway, like some of the guys probably are. Like how many trainers when I manage big clubs, I would have some of these trainers that were just like shredded, and you could see like their 8 packs through their stomachs, like through their shirts, and you see them in the cafeteria and they're eating like two pizzas, bag of
right,
chips, soda, like, and they just eat garbage. They have no idea how they're that lean, and they can't get anyone else that lean. And it's
right.
just some people are just really genetically gifted in all areas.
So you said before you wanted to touch on like how PD usage kind of changed people's perspectives. I don't know if you want to like dive into that anymore or like what you saw.
Oh yeah. So what I thought was really interesting is so at that time of not ever doing it myself, it's always left up to like conjecture of how much they really help. So a lot of guys when we would come over from other countries, and like some of them would kind of play it off like, it doesn't really help that much. It's like they would kind of blow it off, and some other guys were like, it really does. And I met this guy, his name is like Fernando Vasquez, and I believe he was like the champion for Mexico or something. And he'd come over and started training with us for a while, and he was interesting because he had been very open that he had been on PDs forever. I didn't care. And because he's like, everybody does, so why wouldn't you do it? And he had done enormous lifts. I think he's done like 180 snatch and a 220 clean and jerk, and I think he was a 105, pretty close to that. And but he was now trying to make a comeback when he was like 37, and he was like completely natural. And so he was goal was just to try and get back to what he had done on PEDs, and he wasn't even coming close. And he
Yeah.
was like, his best snatch now was like 150, and his best clean and jerk was like 185, and it looked like
Mhm.
garbage and heavy. And he was just like, and so one day I was like, do you think it's because it's older? Because he wasn't that much older. I said, or do you really think that they really help you that much? He's like, no, no. He goes, I could make you a world champion if he's like, if you would take what I'd say, I would make you a world champion. And he was like, you could make a world champion of anybody walking off the street. And I was like, I don't know about that, but because there's
Yeah.
definitely some genetics there. Like you can't take a guy who's 120 pounds and make him into a super or a world champion.
Yeah.
But I understand this point. Like if you've got a good starting base and you put someone on a good pro, like it doesn't, when people say it doesn't really help, I think that's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. And I think that now that I'm on it myself, I'm like, of course it fucking helps. It gives you an enormous advantage.
Yeah.
Like my progression right now in the weight room now, it feels like you're like 18 again. Where every week
Really?
you can add 5 or 10 pounds to the bar every single week, no
Wow.
problem. Like, and it's just like the biggest thing I'm being cautious of is just my joints, because
Yeah.
that was the reason I went on. And I know
Right.
that like you can get so much stronger that you can snap tendons or injure yourself. So I'm being really cautious of my progression so I just don't get hurt.
Yeah, yeah, that's what Ben Pekulski drives me nuts with that because like there was I think actually in it might have been Bigger, Faster, Stronger or maybe it was Pumping Iron. In one of those videos, Ben Pekulski's like, I could make you a Mr. Olympia, but like you won't do it. You won't train as hard as me. And he
Yeah.
really seems to believe that it's just what he does training wise and nutrition wise, which is insane. But yes, people will think that, which is obviously not true, but they make a tremendous difference. And I think some people I've even talked to recently that really brought that to light is Pete Rubish, if you saw him and like how much of a
Mm-hmm.
huge difference he's come off everything. Cornelius Parkins, another one. He said he did it instead of going natural to enhance. I mean, obviously he started natural, but he competed at like, I don't know, 2 something, maybe 220. And then he then went natural and competed. And then he was literally like 35 pounds lighter on stage. And he wasn't even doing like insane doses.
Mm-hmm.
And then somebody I saw post recently was Jared Feather. And he was saying, he was like, well, this was me natural. I think it was like 3.5 years ago. And this is me enhanced. And he even said he's used just moderate dosages, taking his time. And in 3.5 years, he's added over 30 pounds to his stage weight, which means his off-season
Jesus.
weight is
Oh,
probably
like 50 or
45, 50
60.
pounds. Yeah, something like that. And again, that's 3 years of moderate dosage on a complete genetic elite. So like it truly is like just mind-boggling how much it can add. Now, I will add the caveat that you have certainly, I'm sure, I've definitely seen people who have used gear who are very unimpressive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously there's a huge genetic aspect there to how you respond to it. I mean, I have a friend who's
Mm-hmm.
a buck 70. He used gear, he got up to like 182, and then he lost it all immediately afterwards, right? So that you see that too.
Well, I've got some clients to your point who are on. God, I had one client, and I shit you not, his whatever doc started him on I think 500 a week when he
Wow.
first started. He was also on HGH. I mean, he was on a ton of stuff, and he doesn't even look like he lifts. I mean,
Yeah.
he still looks like he did before. He's just 20 pounds heavier from water retention because diet sucks. You know what I mean? And that's the thing I noticed when I went on TRT. It's like it's not that the things that you would apply as a natural trainee don't work, because they do, especially if you have progression in place, you have consistency, you have rest and recovery, and you have obviously the right amount of calories. It absolutely works. The difference is, and I remember reading one time that said, and I don't know if this is true, but it was saying like when they were talking about essentially what PEDs do in terms of speeding up the process. And it was saying like PEDs would basically take, you could accomplish something in 3 months on PEDs that might take you a year. Well, I would take it way further. You're going to accomplish things on PDs you couldn't accomplish naturally ever.
Oh,
Because
sure.
like,
Yeah.
I've known guys that have gone from, I knew one guy that went from 180 to 320 and became an elite level power lifter and took lots of gear and could bench over 750. And now he weighs about 210 and he
Wow.
doesn't look like he lifts. And I'm just saying like some guys like, they think it's a panacea and it's not. If you don't take care of yourself and you don't live a healthy lifestyle, you're not really going to notice anything out of it. But what I've definitely noticed is just if you live your normal lifestyle, like, I mean, I could easily, like right now I'm at 195 and I'm easily as lean as I normally am. And I'm probably 175. Like I'm very
Since
lean right
switching to
now.
the TRT, you mean?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Wow.
All I have done, and so I have two female clients who are also there. So in my health coaching program, they're not actually exercising right now because they have some health coaching problems. So like they have some issues we're working through, like thyroid issues and just some disease processes. So they're not actually exercising yet, and they're only doing sub-Q based off the recommendation of their practitioner. And if you saw how their body has changed just by eating healthy, walking each day, they're not even lifting or exercising yet, you wouldn't believe some of the fat loss and just in terms of like the abdomen, the hip, like the legs, like it just melts off. But only if they're doing what they need to do. And these aren't even women with like great genetics by any means. And like I said, and they're not super overweight. And like what I've noticed with mine, because I always take all my measurements just to like monitor progress, like nothing has really changed. I would say I'm probably as big as I've ever been in like chest, arms, and legs, but my waist is probably as small as it's been like normally like 170. Like it's
Mm.
super tiny. So the thing I noticed that I didn't notice much for like honestly the first 4 weeks. I just noticed like my joints stopped hurting, I had better well-being, and I had more energy. I slept better. And I also noticed that with testosterone, I can fast easier. I could never fast or do intermittent fasting before. I'd be so hungry and so miserable. Now sometimes like I'll eat and I'll forget to eat like all day. And
Yeah.
so I'll have to eat again at night. And I know a lot of guys on TRT complain about the appetite increase. Like it's been great for me in terms of stabilizing my appetite.
Mm.
So I always track my intake, and I did before, and I still do the same style training. So all my variables are the same. The only single one thing I have changed is TRT. And the difference, like I have abs, the way my abs look now, I'm like literal, like some guys are like, oh, I have veins in my abs. Like I actually do have veins in my abs,
Yeah.
and I actually have abs like most of the time,
Yeah.
even without trying that hard or doing any cardio. And I'm just saying, for me, without being TRT, that would have never happened. Like there's no, I'd be 20 pounds lighter and doing cardio like crazy and starving.
See, and this is people, I think, I mean, most of the people actually like that I talk about it a lot, but some people do complain that I talk about genetics so much. But like, this is why, because it's like, it is by far, in my opinion, the most important factor. Because something that that guy Cornelius Parkins said was that TRT adds 20 pounds. And I said I hugely disagree with that. The reason being that literally almost every study on testosterone does not comport with that. The studies showing higher doses, 600 milligrams, show about that much, right? It was way above TRT doses. I have numerous clients on TRT, and some of which still, I mean, one guy is in his 40s, frankly, like again, would fall into like the doesn't look like he lifts category, went on TRT from an actually legitimately low level and said that the main thing he noticed is just that he's got a little bit more energy. And I mean, you can look, scan the forearms and over you'll find guys who say maybe it added a couple pounds, but it's mostly that they feel better, right? That's why they did it.
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest that that 20 pounds you put on is because you have those clear elite level genetics, and maybe
Mm-hmm.
you just have such a strong response to androgens that it's causing that. So it's both great that you're putting it out there that, hey, it made such a big difference. I also don't want people to think that like anybody on TRT is going to get that, because I believe that that's very atypical.
Absolutely. And I do want to stress that as well, because I'm also a hyper responder, and I've known that forever. Like I'm one of those people, like I didn't know what testosterone felt like, so it couldn't have been a placebo effect. And I could tell a difference the first shot I ever took within 10 minutes. It was just like you drank a pot of coffee. All of a sudden I was like, I was so focused. I was so alert. I was like, what just happened? So for me, I'm very, like I said, I respond really well. And I also do like everything right, quote unquote, that someone's going to do.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And so like I practice a healthy lifestyle, and I do all the things that you try and, we were trying to teach people. So for me, yeah, it makes a huge difference. But that's why, because even some of my clients are like, wow, like you seem like it's really helped you. I'm like, yeah, but you've got to do all the things I do to get that. Like, it's not like I eat McDonald's and I drink all the time and I sleep like crap and I barely train. It's like, I still pretty live like, with the exception of my workload with my client schedule, it's still pretty much the same as when I've always competed. I protect my time. I don't go out. Like I go to bed early. Like I just hang out with my wife. I rarely drink. Like it's pretty much like a bodybuilding lifestyle. So if you're going to get like amazing results, you also have to live a pretty, structured lifestyle that's consistent.
Yeah, I think last comment I would make on that is just that I was thinking about this last week actually, because we were at the beach with like some of my college friends, and I was thinking about like podcasts I'm doing. I knew we had this one coming up, and an example is just like, so I have this friend Josh who he would be the guy who, if he took it as seriously as we do, you'd say there's no way he's natural. Like he literally just like he was like a finance dude in New York, so he just stopped training entirely for like years.
Mm-hmm.
We saw him at the beach, and he was like, "Yeah, I've been back in it a couple months." The dude got up to like 240, just
Yeah.
like house. I'm like, I literally could never achieve this thickness in
Mm-hmm.
my life. So to your point, like, you things that you just could never do. It's just, and he was like a high level baseball player. He
Mm-hmm.
clearly had pretty good genetics. But it's just, I used to get annoyed by it. Now I just kind of like marvel at it. Like it's just impressive.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, man, like you just see some of these people and it's just like, wow. And obviously, I mean, you're an extreme example of that, but it's just interesting to see it. And I think people tend to want to like, I can understand the resistance to talking about genetics, because basically what you're saying is, hey, you can't do anything about it. And we like to believe that we have full control over like our outcomes in life, which frankly, I think there's a lot of, we don't call it luck, genetics, whatever to it, right? A lot of out of your control. So I understand the resistance to it. And it's not meant to be demotivating to people. It's just meant to be like, hey, like better to be aware of it than spend like 2 decades being frustrated thinking you're doing something wrong.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great point, because to that point, like, I was one of those guys, like I said, started when I was 12, read every muscle magazine there was. This is before the internet. Read everything you could possibly do. Like, that's all I did. Like, I had a key to the high school weight room. Like, I would go there all the time. Like that was my thing. It's all I did. And you get some of these people to that point. The thing that once I got on TRT, and you kind of see like how your body changes and you start to know what to look for people who are on it. And I would say, I don't want to be like the guy who's like, well, everyone who's in shape is on it, because that's not true. But there are people who are in amazing shape that I can guarantee you would look nothing like they look like if they were taking what they're taking.
Yeah.
And the problem I have with that is because they're also coaches who espouse that they're natural. And then if you're looking between, like, say, someone like you or me versus someone like that who's like 250 and shredded from head to toe, like, well, I'm gonna work out with that guy because you don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, that guy's probably gonna be $160 without it because I know that guy. So that's the kind of stuff that really irritates me about it. And when you start to see like just the vascularity, like I can see like just how thick my tricep has become. Like it's just like you just get so dense. Like, and when I think of like when I would see like videos or pictures of Dorian Yates lifting, and I was like, God damn, that guy's just so thick. I mean, he's like a fucking dinosaur, and it's like you start to look like that. You're like, I'm 195 pounds and like you're just so thick from front to back, and you always feel like you have a pump constantly because of the vasal effects of testosterone. And it's just crazy. It's a totally different world.
That's awesome. So let's dive into a little bit about diets and different responses to different diets. I was looking at some of the stuff, and this might be an area we disagree on. I don't know. We haven't talked about it previously, so we'll see where it goes. But I know we both tried an extensive list of pretty much every diet out there. So what are maybe some trends that you've found for yourself and clients?
So again, being an extremist, I have done literally, honestly, everything from a fruitarian to a carnivore. And I have tracked my labs on it just to see what would happen. And I think, so when you talk about genetics are important because genetics will definitely determine how you respond to nutrition. So for example, what really kind of started my whole exploring different dietary routes, because I was pretty much always just like, if you want to call it like paleo-ish, whole foods, bodybuilder style eating. But like, that's all I had done. And I have actually always really done well with low fat, high carb, even though I'm not genetically a very lean person. And for me to get lean, it's really difficult. I actually find that I do much better calories controlled, compared to like high carb versus low fat or low carb versus high fat. I do better on low fat, always have. When I started running my genetics, that's why. So I have all the Alzheimer's genes. I have the PEMT gene, which disposes you to like fatty liver and gallbladder issues. I had terrible times with high fat diets. So I was trying keto because all of my clients wanted to try keto, and I would never give someone before I had done it, so I could at least walk them through the process. And I got really sick, and it was after my show when I'd lost like 50 pounds, and I was trying like a lean gains thing back with keto just because I always want to try it. And I'm like, well, I'm gonna gain my weight back anyway. Let's just see what happens. And about 7 weeks in, I started getting really sick, like really nauseous. Started getting very pale stools, like tons of, like gallbladder pain, basically. And everyone's like, oh, and I just like so exhausted and always nauseous. And everyone's like, oh, it's part of the keto flu. Like you just give this terrible advice. And like, that's not what's happening. Like my gallbladder was like essentially shutting down. And then my appendix ruptured and I didn't know it. And I was actually doing a consult with a client and it just felt like a horse kicked me in the stomach. And I was just like, it was the worst pain I'd ever had. And I just basically fell over at my desk and an ambulance came and got me. And I went to the hospital and my appendix had actually ruptured like earlier that day. And I was like septic and I was very sick. I was in the hospital for a few days. They took it out. And when they did, they actually found a tumor on my pancreas and they found a tumor in my hip. So I have a malignant tumor on my kidney the size of a golf ball. And I have a benign tumor the size of a golf ball inside my hip. So that kind of was what spawned. Yep. That's kind of what spawned my dietary change. So with the whole push of, plant-based and, anti-cancer and this, and there are some studies with this in terms of lower amino acid availability, lowering mTOR, like these type of things in a plant-based world. So I became vegan for 5 years. I went vegan overnight and I monitor it with scans and lab work. And I still do every single year. It's still there, but it's slightly smaller. So I didn't have the surgery for multiple reasons that I really get into. It was more basically just, I wanted to know what I was doing was working. Because it's just like blood work. If they find a problem, you don't know how long the problem's been there. You don't know if it's new. You don't know if it's stable. You don't even know if it's receding. You just see a problem. And so everyone freaks out. So before I'm freaked out, I said, let's just get some data first. So I started doing labs and scans every 90 days. And then I started doing them every 6 months. And now I've gone out to like once a year. And it's never changed. And it's still there. And it's never grown. So when I was talking to my surgeon, who's from Sloan Kettering, he's like, you see this sometimes. He's like, it can be malignant, but it's also what we call indolent. So it's not going to do anything. It's never going to grow. It's never going to hurt you, but it is there and it is cancer. He's like, it's slightly encapsulated. So there's no point in taking it out. He's like, we can if we want to. He's like, but until it changes, and that's why I do routine scans. He's like, until it changes, there's no point. So I just haven't done it. So that being said, that's why I changed all these diets. And when I went vegan, I think that it definitely has some benefits. And I'm not going to say it's like the game changer movie where it's like, it's going to increase your performance, because it's not. It's not going to give you an unfair advantage over any other diet, because it doesn't. And the reason why I actually stopped being vegan over the course of time, besides the fact that I apparently have horrendous IBS that does not do well on a vegan diet, and I can't do a keto diet because I can't eat high fat. I do high carb, and I do high carb, low fat. And I went back to eating like half plant and half animal. So I do better if I don't eat tons of meat, but I do eat like maybe a pound a day. And the rest of my protein comes from, like, plant products. And I do just fine. And I noticed that even training that way, as long as I kept my protein, like where it usually is, which is I usually go for 1 gram a pound is typically what I do. And for fat, I usually do about 60 to 70 grams a day. That's kind of my threshold. If I start going above that, I'll start getting some fat malabsorption symptoms. So I don't really go that much higher. And my carbs are usually between 250 to 300 a day. And then I'll send it around my workout. So all I do is, if I went vegan, like, I just switch my food choices, but I still hit those same numbers. And if I did this, like when I was fruitarian, and the reason why I was fruitarian is because it's the easiest diet to digest when you have horrendous IBS and can't eat anything. I mean, I got to the point when my IBS was so bad, I actually got down to 155 pounds. I actually lost 30 pounds at one point, and that was after my stomach surgery, and I was skin and bones. Like I stopped lifting. That was actually the only break I've ever taken in 28 or 30 years of training. I had to take 6 months off. And when I came back, it was really hard to come back and really struggle. So that was why I was trying the different diets. And like I said, I did fine on vegan as long as the calories, everything were the same. I just got tired of taking so many protein shakes and other things just to try and keep my protein up. And I just wanted to eat more real foods. And I just kind of got bored after eating that way. So when I went back to eating meat, I definitely noticed. And if you look at my labs too, my testosterone was actually pretty low when I was vegan. But my free testosterone was the highest it's ever been. My free testosterone was 60 when I was a vegan. But my total testosterone was only 450. And to show how much stress affects testosterone, because I pull mine all the time, when I started training for my show in 2015, my testosterone was like 830. We're going to say total was like 830 something. By the end of the show, it was down to like barely 400. And then after my stomach surgery, because that was right after that, it dropped to 200 right after my stomach surgery, because I wanted to test it right after the stomach surgery.
Your total testosterone?
Yeah, it just tanked. And so it started coming back up, but I've had so many different times when I've checked, and it's so volatile. Like your levels will go crazy. I mean, I've seen it as high as 900, and I've seen it as low as 200 on me, and that's never even taking anything. That's just how it fluctuates via stress. So, but I definitely notice food choices changes. Anytime I eat less meat or less animal products, my total testosterone drops, but my free goes up. Anytime I start eating more animal products, my total testosterone goes up, and my free drops every single time. So I kind of do in the middle. And that's what I found works for me in terms of, if I eat 180 grams of protein a day, half comes from plant, half comes from animal. It's pretty easy. And if you look at all the studies, they always say that at least 50% of the protein comes from a higher available source. So that's why I keep 50% of my protein from animals. And I'm doing that just to try and keep mTOR and some of these other growth factors also low as I'm aging because of the tumors. I'm trying to keep them in check so they don't go crazy. And so there's a lot of stipulations why I do those diets. But I noticed, like I said, probably for me, I work best if I do eat a little bit of animal products. And I do see that even with vegans, they actually do better if they eat a little bit meat. Doesn't mean they have to eat tons of it, but they actually do better if they eat a little bit of it. But I would say that if you're going to do an extremism, either keto or even honestly, even just super high carb, low fat, which some guys like to do, you should really have your genetics pulled to determine if that is an appropriate move for you, because it may not be. Like I said, I thought keto was going to be fine, and it turned out it's the absolute worst thing I could do. And if you look at my genetic reports, so for that, what I did is you can go to 23andMe and just get your ancestry data. And then you can go to Rhonda Patrick's site on the foundmyfitness.com, and you can upload your raw data, and she'll kick out a report that goes through all the genes and the different SNPs. And it actually explains it really well. So you don't have to be a genius to read these.
Which one did you use, you said?
So I used Found My Fitness with Dr. Rhonda Patrick.
Okay.
Because a lot of hers are more like, it's not just longevity, but a lot of hers are performance or nutrient based. And I actually do really well plant based. Like I convert plant-based fats to ALA or EPA and DHA really well. Like I actually convert vitamin A, from beta carotene to retinol. I actually do all those things really well according to my genetics. So I actually do veganism really well, but not a lot of people can. I've seen some of my clients try it and just crumble. So I think it depends on the person. It depends on their digestive status, to be more importantly, what they can and can't tolerate.
You mentioned that you have the digestive issues with pure vegan. So I would assume from like all the volume and fiber. But then you said that you still get most of your carbs from plant sources. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, a lot of fruit. So what I do though now is it's more low FODMAP-ish carbs. So like I don't eat a ton of like cruciferous vegetables because they just kill my stomach. So I primarily just leafy greens, and I saute them a lot.
Yeah.
Post surgery, I have an adhesion and some kinks in my colon now, so I have to be really careful with how much fiber I have. And again, I didn't know that, and I went into a vegan diet where I'm eating like 150 grams of fiber a day, and
Yeah.
quickly gave myself ulcerative colitis real fast. So that was fun after a while. And so you just kind of learn how to manipulate these things. But yeah, I keep most of my carbs. So I use Vitargo or Vitago, how you want to pronounce it. I always called it Vitargo, but it's just a carb powder. That's usually what I use during my workout. I use about 50 grams during that. And I use most of my carb sources are like quinoa and fruit. I do well on those. And my blood sugar stays really low when I eat those versus other ones. And I don't have any GI issues with those. So those are where most of my carbs come from.
Adding up your macros, it sounds like you're only eating like 23 to 2,500 calories.
I am right now because I'm cutting a little bit. Now that's what's interesting is I've always been able to cut on 12 calories per pound pretty easily. But because I'm on my feet all day, so I have a much higher activity level, I've noticed that I could actually start cutting on more 14 to 15 calories per pound. But I noticed on testosterone, like if I'm only eating 14 or 1500 calories for 14 to 15 calories per pound, so like say 2,700 to 2,800, I'll get really lean really quickly. It's almost like I start losing weight too fast. So the only reason I'm this low right now is because it's summer and we have a party going on, coming up. So I was just leaning down for that. Outside of that, normally I'll eat 3,000 to 3,500 pretty much every day just for maintenance.
I have a patient who he puts away like the carts and stuff for like a grocery store, and he said he gets like 27 to 29,000 steps a day. I'm like, dude, I get like 4,000 steps a day if I'm not like doing anything. Like my Monday through Thursday, I work a lot of hours. I mean, literally, I'll get like 4,000. I just like don't know how these people are doing, unless you have a job like that, or I guess you're like at the gym or something. I don't know how people are routinely getting like 15, 20,000 every day.
I would say on mine, the lowest you'll ever see mine is 15,000. That's a slow day for me. Because the Garmin one I have is constantly adjusting up or down based off your current activity, and it'll set you a new step goal. And like yesterday, I had 27,000 steps. Like that was a work day for me. That's a pretty common day for me. On the weekends, it's usually at least that high because then we have a bunch of land. I just do projects the whole time. And it's like a long time ago, I made a shift away from doing cardio all the time and just looking at it as movements and steps. So now, like on the weekends, instead of just doing boring ass cardio, like I'll just go work on my land or we'll go do something, just be outside all day. And so for me, I just don't ever set.
Yeah, man, that's crazy. I think literally on my like whole history of steps, so since like I don't know, last 5 years, the highest I've ever hit was 27,000, and that was like we went to one beach, met a family there, walked for 2 or 3 hours, went to another beach, walked along there, went to the boardwalk. I was like, how could this be everybody's day? But yeah, I mean, obviously it increases your caloric requirements to some degree, so I guess there's that benefit.
I'm usually at 10,000 steps every day by lunch, but pretty routinely.
Wow. Do you you mentioned a focus on mTOR, and I do think mTOR and like autophagy, there's these kind of like buzzwords that people just like say. So I don't get into it too much, but are you not concerned about testosterone increasing phosphorylation of mTOR?
Not necessarily, because there's some other things you can do to slow it down. And I think too, like I think people get so hyper focused on mTOR in terms of like, this really slows it down or this really speeds it up. And I'm like, we don't really know that. Most people, you're so individually unique anyway. Like IGF-1 is going to play into that. Eating windows will play into that. There's a lot of things that are going to play into mTOR. Total caloric intake is going to play into mTOR. So that's one of the other reasons you'll see me like, I typically, how my nutrition runs is Monday through Friday, I usually stay 23 to 2,400 calories. So I can keep my calories down most of the time. And then on Saturday and Sunday, I'll bring them up to 3,000. That's typically how I maintain and where I operate at, with the mindset I'm trying to restrict my calories a little bit. And so I also take 2,000 milligrams a day of metformin. And I also take 2,000 milligrams a day of berberine, because when they can compact together, they work on different portions of mTOR and IGF. They don't do the same thing. A lot of people, they're completely different, actually. They actually alternate on slightly different pathways. And I also take statin, because statins combined with metformin will almost shut down mTOR like almost to a screeching halt. So I do a lot of things to do that on purpose, and it's still never affected my progress. So either they're not really working, or mTORs are not really that manipulative, if that makes sense. So I don't really honestly worry about too much.
Are you taking ubiquinol or ubiquinone for being on the statin?
Yes. Oh yeah, for sure. So I take CoQ10. So the reason for that is I pulse the statin. I don't routinely take it all the time. Because if you look at the research on even just combining like metformin with a lipophilic based statin, like you see, because they both shut down mTOR, they both shut down IGF-1, they stop fatty acid synthesis. Like they block a lot of things together in terms of what cancer cells will use for growth or metastasis. So I purposely do a lot of these things. I do take some other off-label drugs that are, like I take fibenzanol, which is a type of drug. It's actually an anti-parasitic drug, but off-label. It basically acts as a glucose blocker for cancer cells. So I do a few different drug therapies that I alternate in conjunction with this. And I do periods of fasting and for the autophagy in terms of like the self-eating process. But I don't want to get into the whole tangent of that, because doing this for cancer is entirely different than doing it for longevity, because it's so much more intense. So I don't want to get into that. But at the same time, it's not affecting my progress. And so I see a lot of people like, oh, I started taking metformin, now I can't get any bigger. I'm like, that's not doing anything. Yeah. Or it's like, you know how much metformin? I've taken up to like 3,000 milligrams of metformin at once, just like throughout the day, just to see if I ever got the GI effects. You only get GI effects when you have a bad gut. I mean, that's how it works. Like if I start eating like poor food choices or honestly bread on metformin, I will get the worst IBS ever. But if I just cut it out, I'm totally fine. So a lot of people, it's not as responsive as people think it is, I don't think.
Yeah, and just for people listening who maybe don't know, the reason I asked is about the ubiquinol or ubiquinone is just because when you do take a statin, it's been shown to deplete CoQ10 levels. So it's often recommended to replace those. And ubiquinol, more so than CoQ10, increases CoQ10 levels in the blood. So a lot of times people recommend it, especially with age, they find the conversions a little bit worse. So just for people who are curious about that. Well, I was just going to comment that the whole genetic thing with diet is interesting because it's like, of course, I think we talked about how like genetics influence pretty much everything. Of course, there's some genetic variation with like how people respond to different diets, right? There's thoughts on like that could be like culturally, right? When you have like, tens of thousands of years in a certain area that, that where your background is could affect it. I don't know how confident I am as far as I think it's like emerging, right? Rhonda Patrick does talk about like, well, this, SNP has been shown to alter this. And I think it's going there. I don't, and again, it could just be an area I haven't looked into enough. But as far as like, okay, we clearly have the answers for like, if you have this, if you're on this side of the genetic spectrum, this diet works better for you and you can tolerate carbs. Cause I definitely seen people get very gimmicky with that where they're prescribing, there was like the blood type diet, and I'm not saying that's the same thing, but I guess I'm just saying I'm not confident enough in my knowledge there to say if it's kind of like BS or not. So that might just kind of putting that out there.
Yeah, and to your point, it's not that the nutrigenomics side of that is not an exact science yet. And so when you look at some of those, even if you look up like even on Rhonda Patrick's reports, if you look at some of them, like the sample size, be like, well, out of 250 people, I'm like, well, that's a pretty small sample. So when you're looking at a lot of those things, you do have to take it for a grain of salt and realize too, like, it's not diagnostic. It's just saying like, this is a propensity, like, especially if you're looking at a disease process, like Alzheimer's, for example. Like some people don't want to pull their genetic report because they don't want to see the Alzheimer's. Like, well, just because you have it doesn't mean you're guaranteed to get it.
Yeah.
But wouldn't you want to know that you have a propensity for it so you could live a healthy lifestyle to maybe potentially avoid it? Versus just going into it blindly. I see that a lot of people just don't like to know data on that. I'm like, and I get it. When I found a couple spots on myself, like I said, with the tumors and stuff, there's a lot of things you don't want to learn about, in the beginning, and you just want to ignore it, but it doesn't help. So I think that, just learning that is really helpful.
Yeah, no, I definitely fall into that category of like testing too much, probably, right? You get some, actually I saw Peter Attia, he said he and his wife do like full body MRIs yearly. Which I know some other people like really disagree with that. And I think especially like if you're like, let's say you take like an 80-year-old, right? And you get what they call like incidentalomas, right? Where it's like, there's so many things you're going to find that are not going to kill this person before something else kills them and just like leave it alone. But I'm also somebody who likes to know like everything. So I've had so much blood work done and I probably overanalyze things. There's probably a happy medium in there.
For sure. I mean, yeah, like when they first, and you should never pull your lab reports and interpret your health condition when you're sick, or like if you have the flu or like surgery. Yeah. And I remember like when my appendix ruptured, I'm like sitting like in my hospital bed, like, and so the way our hospital works is like, as soon as your labs are done, they immediately send you an email letting you know your labs are in, and you don't review them with the doctor. You just get the results. Yeah. So I'm like sitting in the hospital bed. I'm like, oh shit. And I'm just like looking through this. I'm like, look at this. And I'm like looking at this. I'm like, that's leukemia. I'm like, no, that's a viral infection. I'm just like, all right, well, so you can definitely make yourself probably more sick than you probably really are. Yeah. You know what I mean? From the placebo effect by looking at, or nocebo effect by looking things up.
Yeah, for sure. So Matt, we covered a lot there. Was there anything that you wanted to discuss that we didn't get into?
I think, I think one thing would be interesting is terms of like, I don't really touch the whole failure debate. I think that's really funny. I think it's a
Mm,
pretty simple discussion, but you either fail or you don't. But that's another long story. I think one thing that's interesting is I think from a training perspective of looking at, being natural to now enhanced and like what over those course of those times what I felt like really worked best. And everything like I said, when you're doing it naturally, I feel like it just works so much better when you're enhanced and it works faster. But I also see like I think almost anything works when you're enhanced for the most part, especially if you have good genetics. Like I see
yeah,
guys trained like idiots and they still look great just
yeah.
because they're enhanced. But what I would say is one of the things maybe takeaway for people in training, one of the things that worked really well for me, how we got in terms of Olympic lifting, you're training 2 to 3 times a day. Like we would train 3 times a day during the off season, but most of the time it's 2 times a day, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and you would train once a day on Saturday and once a day on Tuesday. So we're getting like 8 workouts a weekend. And what I really noticed back then was that frequency, like as our frequency and volume went up, I got enormous. As our frequency and volume tapered down for competition, I shrunk. So I learned back then that training frequency and volume are obviously very important. I think then the most important thing is as you age and as if you're a really stressed individual and don't sleep that well, you can't train that much. You can't train often because you can't recover. So when you're looking at these different types of training methodologies in terms of should I do a whole body, should I do a split, like a lot of it's going to depend on your training frequency and how many times a week you're going to have to train, and it's going to depend on your recovery ability. And what I've actually found, what always worked really well for me, and I see it work really well for my clients, is more of an undulating periodization model and even more like total body-ish throwing in with some splits. And what I mean by that is like, for example, with my own training routine, I will do really heavy upper body on Monday and really heavy lower body on Tuesday. And it's more like sets of 3, sets of 4, those type of things, like 5x3, 60x2, just really working on limit strength and just really like trying to work my over strength, right? And then like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, it's more traditional type bodybuilding type stuff. And I'll focus more on that. So for me, I've always noticed personally, if I do high rep and like low rep types training in the same cycle, even in the same week, I grow like crazy. And I've seen that with my clients too. They actually do really well with that. So just if people are looking at changing their training or looking how to train or maybe looking at doing something different, if you're not trying that, I've always found that worked really well. And that was something that I kind of took away from Olympic lifting because we would do total body all day and I would do bodybuilding at night. So technically I would do 4 workouts a day. And so I just noticed like we got enormous when we did that and you would just eat and sleep and grow. So I've noticed that now as I age, like that type of training philosophy of mostly total body, most workouts with a little bit of specialization seems to work most, obviously great for me. Most things work for me and other people. I will tell you things that don't work really well for me is when I train a body part once per week. Well,
Hmm.
it seems like all my other body parts start shrinking pretty fast. But if
Yeah.
I do total body, just a little bit of volume each session, I seem to get really big really quickly. So just for whatever that's worth for takeaway, I see a lot of people when they feel like they're stuck, they're like, well, maybe I should be doing a different split. It's like, probably just not eating enough, sleeping enough, training frequently enough, doing
Yeah.
enough volume, you and to like also say like if you feel like you're stuck after 4 or 5 years of training, not to jump on PEDs yet and really start pushing it longer because I made gains up until I was 40.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it may not be in the same area, like I might shift it around, but you still make progress.
I think two comments on that I would say is as far as it's interesting, like when I was getting into this like 15 plus years ago, splits were talked about a lot, right? I mean, I was in magazines like, what's the split? And it was like, what's the ideal split? And I'm glad to see that that's almost never talked about as far as like I see nowadays. People do talk about, again, this could just be the circles I run in, but it's like, what's the frequency you need? And like, there's so many ways that you can, kind of parry out that volume, right? Versus like, it's got to be chest back, then arms this day. Like I don't see people talk about that as much anymore, which I think is good. But then also, one caveat is with your frequency as far as like the 2, 3 times a day. Would you agree that part of the reason that was possible is because the Olympic lifting doesn't have much of an eccentric component, so there was a lot less damage being done to the muscle?
That's actually a great point. And I'm glad you brought that up because I argue with people that a lot because they're like, Olympic lifters are big and jacked from Olympics. I'm like, no, they're not. Most Olympic lifters, if they don't do any accessory work, you wouldn't even know they lift. I've seen world champions that can snatch more than me and can deadlift 600 pounds that look like they can't lift a broomstick. I'm saying like, and these aren't guys who are enhanced either. These are even natural guys. So I'm saying like, no. And that's so kind of how our workout structure is. Your first workout of the morning, you only did 1 or 2 movements. So it's like squat and press. That's it. And you come back like 2 hours later and you do like a lift and a pull. So you might do power snatch and a pull. That's it. And if we're training 3 days or 3 times a day, you come back in the afternoon, clean and jerk and a pull. That's it. And it was really more modeled after the Bulgarian model,
Mhm.
where they would come in and just do like max out on one lift, come back 45 minutes later, max out, and they would do that all day, every day. and we were natural. And so like our coaches from Romania and try to put us on, and we would just break all the time, like 6 or 7 weeks in, like everything would be broken. So yeah, I think that that's definitely part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I did the like modified Bulgarian that was kind of popularized maybe 4 or 5 years ago with Greg Knuckles and all them. And I was squatting 5 to 6 days a week. And I mean, it was great, but that's because I would work up to like a working max that day, right? Not going to true failure. So
Mm-hmm.
obviously, like you can do it, but you got to change things around the other variables so that you don't break, as you said.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For sure. And I actually do like training a little bit like that. And I'd say shout out probably to Jeff Nippard, because I do like his total body setup. The way he had this total body routine thing he'd put out a while ago. And I always like to look at other people's ideas. And it was very similar to what I had created myself when we were doing Olympic thing, what I do now. As I pick a primer movement for the first movement of the day. So if it's a chest focused day, it's gonna be really heavy bench press. And I might do one more exercise for chest, and the rest is gonna be an exercise for each, total body, right? So it's probably like 5 or 6 exercises each one. And then maybe one day sets of 3, one day sets of 15. So typical UDT format. But I noticed that, if I'm only doing 1 or 2 movements for one muscle group, I could put so much more intensity and effort into it. And I find like when I'm doing traditional bodybuilding workouts, we're maybe doing like 10 or 15 sets for the same muscle for the same workout. Like I'm just pacing. I'm trying to pace myself. There's no way you're going to failure like that. But I could go into failure, like true failure. If I'm just doing 1 or 2 sets, I will generally kind of do what you're doing, is I'll work my way up. So if I'm doing 5x5, those first 4, like, they're working up weights. My last set's almost more of like a Dorian Yates thing, where he would work up a bunch and then one set was all out. That's typically how I train. And I find that I can recover better that way, and I'm not as sore. And I also found, just because I'm getting older and my knees are getting shit, that from squatting like every day for, I don't know, a couple of decades, like they're done. So I've noticed just by doing one extra leg exercise every day and wrapping my knees, like I can train legs super hard again. But I can't really handle leg days anymore because my knees just get way too trashed. And I think that's largely just because I'm walking so much. I notice those days where I'm like 25,000 steps after a leg day, my knees are generally swollen and just a little bit. I mean, they're really sore. So it's probably some of that too.
Yeah, I made a video, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago now. And it was like how bodybuilders actually train. And the studies actually show better results oftentimes with straight sets. But again, I think studies are great, but you're oftentimes looking at beginners, and there's a lot of other things you're not looking at long term. Almost every bodybuilder, especially back in like the 90s and like early 2000s, right? It was like, all right, pick a weight, ramp up, do 1 or 2 max sets, next exercise. Like Ronnie Coleman wasn't doing 5 sets with the same weight on dumbbell and then 5 sets with the same weight on barbell bench. Like that's, I just don't know almost anybody who does that. They ramp up, they hit maybe 2 top sets, and then they go on to the next thing. And like you said, even just mentally, even if you can do that, it's just draining. It's just like, I'm going to do the same weight, 5 sets all out. I mean, it's just, I don't like that way. And it's been forever since I did 15 plus sets of a single body part in one workout. I just never do that anymore.
That's probably my weekly volume right now, is 15 to 18 sets a week, but that includes those workups. So if you're looking at all out, that might only be like 5, maybe 5 or 6 all out sets per body part per week. But that's definitely enough to, like, I grow crazy from, I don't need any more. So I'm actually trying to reduce my volume right now. I'm generally trying to do between 3, no more than 4 sets per, like, all out sets per body part per workout. Like I've substantially lose my back, and I've seen much better progress from it.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that counts, the ramping sets, because that was another big debate. And like there was an article that was a little hyperbolic, I feel like, but it was like, bodybuilders do 1 set, and it's like, it's, again, a little of an exaggeration, but it was like they'll count it as, somebody will say that was 20 sets, and some people will say that was 5 sets, right? And it's like, those ramping sets are important. They're doing something, but it's not at all the same as 18 sets to failure, right?
Well, but also think about, if you're doing 5x5, like say you're doing 5x5, 405 in the squat, you're going to warm up for a while. How many warm up sets are you going to do before you get there? What, like 5 or 6? And then you do 5 working sets. You just did 12 sets for legs and your first exercise. And now you need a whole leg day. I calculated a client's volume one time. A trainer sent me, she was doing like 100, like almost 100 sets by the time you included her working and ramping sets in a workout per workout. And then the workouts were like 90 minutes long. And I'm like, by the 3rd week, she's just destroyed. And I was like, well, this is an insane amount of volume.
Right. All right, Matt. So obviously you do train people, right? You've got some content out there. Where can people find your stuff?
You don't really find me that much, because I kind of like try to be a recluse a little bit on social media. I'm only on YouTube YouTube because I like to watch content, and I hate Facebook and I hate everything else. But you can catch us on our company page, which is, it's called bodysolutionskc.com. That's the studio that my partner and I own. And we work with primarily people in person and online, but that's not really, I appreciate it. Today is really more just about getting the message out, but yeah, you won't see me on social media because I hate social media. I've recently
Awesome.
deleted most of my accounts and I've never been happier.
Gotcha. Gotcha. All right, man. Well, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for kind of getting that experience
Yeah.
out there. And I'm sure we'll talk in the future.
Yeah. Right on, man. Thank you.